Hello everyone, I'm Terry Duke, and welcome to my channel. As a side project, about 2 years ago, I made a video talking about my favorite mods for Warband. And ever since, people have been recommending more and more mods for me to try. And every time I try to make any other type of content, I would always get that one comment asking me when the next Warband mod video is gonna drop. Essentially, Warband modding content has both been the most success I've ever had on social media and the most vicious content cycle that I've struggled to get past. Which is why I'm announcing today that this Warband mod video is going to be my last. It's been quite the adventure, but from now on I will resist the algorithmic urge to just keep making more of it. Because let's be honest, there's nothing more for me to say about Warband mods. I milked the content about as much as I could. However, before I uninstall the game, I have one last video for you. This video is the most ambitious and most ridiculous I've ever done. It is so absurd that up until the very moment I started making it, I had spent months thinking about it and refusing to do it because of just how insane it is. But here we are at the bottom of the barrel. So after ranking all of the mods I ever played, twice, now it's time to bring all of the mods I discovered in those videos, put them together, and then adding all of the mods I've discovered since making those two videos, and then including all the expansions and DLCs from the game that I never really counted as mods, to make the most epic ranking you've ever seen, a ranking of 89 mods. This is not only my last Warband gift to you, but in a lot of ways it's going to be my legacy. Because let's be real here, years from now, decades, Warband gets a new surge in popularity, new people make videos on it, but deep down, you and I will know. No video will ever top the absurdity of this one. So here we go. Every Warband mod ranked. Before we get started though, I have to make a couple of disclaimers, and then I'll explain how the mods are ranked, and then we'll actually do the ranking. So first disclaimer, this ranking is not objective by any means. I had someone comment once that they wished I would make objective rankings rather than with my biases. And this is really dumb because what makes a good mod will depend by and large on what players look for in a mod, on the sentimental value, on their personal tastes. You can't rank art objectively when art by design is subjective. That being said, I had a specific way of ranking the mods to try and narrow it down for my personal taste as much as possible, while also taking into consideration the overall quality of the mod itself. So while doing this ranking, a lot of my opinions changed. Some mods that initially had a lot of novelty and ranked highly in previous videos don't really have that anymore, and so they fell further back. Some mods are very similar from one another, and how I rank them largely depends on which mod I discovered first. And some mods I just don't like, even if they're really good because of personal preferences. So ranking 89 mods by design cannot be fair or objective. Some mods will look like they should rank much higher, and others much lower, but that's just inevitable. Second disclaimer, I am not literally ranking every Warband mod there is, okay? Just the ones I've played over the past few years. So there are still a lot of mods that will not be covered here, so at the risk of someone pointing them out, here are some mods or games or DLCs not included in the ranking. For starters, there's Blood and Gold Caribbean and Gloria Sinica. Both games are Warband clones that you can find on Steam. Officially, they are not part of Warband or Mount & Blade as a whole, so they're not included. There's also many mods that people recommended that I could either not find, or they were too unstable for me to play. The former include The Gathering Storm, East 1135, and Imperial Rome. If those mods exist, I could not find them. And mods that crashed too much to review include Gangs of Glasgow and Lords and Realms. I'm also not a multiplayer kinda guy at all, so any game or mod that is exclusively multiplayer I avoid like the plague. So a popular mod not ranked here is Bear Force 2. This is a Star Wars multiplayer mod that is still active to this day. I don't know of any other multiplayer mods, but whichever one you can think of, I assure you, you won't find it in this video. Also, the one Warband DLC not included here is Napoleonic Wars for the same reason. It's only multiplayer, so I don't care, I'm not buying it. With the disclaimers out of the way, here's how I ranked everything. In part 1, we have the mods that are either too dumb, too wacky, or too experimental to have any kind of substantial replay value. They might be very impressive at first, but they hardly have more than 10 minutes worth of gameplay before they either run out of stuff or crash. In part 2, which is the longest section, these are mods that either have a cool aesthetic but often lack depth, or they're pretty cool but somewhat incomplete. So these can make for a good time but tend to lack replay value. In part 3, these are generally good mods with lots of replayability, but so similar from other mods I've played before that they felt very repetitive. So from here, it's already going to be highly subjective, since it largely depends on the other mods that I discovered first. In part 4, these are fairly solid mods all around that for any given personal reason, just aren't for me, so this part will also be highly contested. In part 5, this is where we get at the pretty good mods that are overall solid, complete, have few bugs, but that might still miss in a few areas for me personally. In part 6 though, those are mods that I think are really good and really high quality that I strongly recommend that everyone gives a try. And finally, in part 7, my top picks. These are all solid, massive, ambitious, and stable, but also taken into consideration here is my nostalgia for some of these mods that I've been playing for years. These have shaped my preferences, and several of them make up a bulk of my playtime on Warband. So this is it. We have the mods, we have the setup. Let's do this. So at number 89, this is CSGO but Warband. And the title here is pretty self-explanatory. It's literally CSGO ported to Warband. However, there's no multiplayer, there's no battle royale of any kind, you just spawn in, you have the cool gun animations, but besides that there's nothing to do. In fact, NPCs barely even respawn at all, and sometimes you might even spawn outside of the map. So it's a pretty funny mod, but there's really not much to it. Similarly, at number 88, we have KOF, which stands for King of Fighters. As far as I know, King of Fighters is a series of fighting games, and in this mod, it's basically, what if we had a 2D character in the 3D world of Warband? And that goes about as well as you'd expect. It's pretty funny when you look at it, but again, there's not much to it. Number 87 is a little better though. This is Warcraft 3 but Warband. And this one is actually pretty impressive, from the scenery, to the items, to the actual units from the game, probably the best looking of them all. However, the creative choice of adding the Warcraft 3 HUD on the bottom of the screen basically makes your character impossible to see. I could forgive it if the mod was at least stable, but while it looks pretty cool, it's also very prone to crashes. That said, I've noticed that the mod is updated fairly often on ModDB, so you could give it a try, maybe it's better now. On number 86, we have Breaking Bad. This is basically native Calradia, but with the addition of the characters from Breaking Bad that you can find in a secret lab where you can buy crystal meth from them and distribute it to a couple of people across Calradia. Besides that one feature, everything else is exactly native Warband. So it's pretty funny, but there's really not much to it. At number 85, we're back to that one wacky modder, and this is Dragon Ball Z Vegeta. And I mean, can you even recognize that it's Warband besides the enemy NPCs? Honestly, it's pretty impressive, don't get me wrong, but I'm talking playability here. There's really not much to do in this mod, and the controls are confusing as hell, so it's pretty funny, but within 10 minutes, I think you've got the full experience. At number 84, we have Diplomacy. This is a native revamped mod, and when I say native revamped, I mean mods that still take place in native Calradia, but add a whole bunch of features. And the prime feature of Diplomacy is, well, nudity. There's a lot of NSFW stuff. I mean, that's the entire purpose of this mod, so I don't really put a lot of value on it. Moving on. At number 83, we have Violence Basketball but Warband, which is the final mod of that one wacky Chinese modder. And this one, of all of the mods, is the most playable. And really the entire point of this mod is that you go all across Calradia and you play matches of either basketball or soccer. Not gonna lie, it's pretty funny, and in a previous ranking, because of how surprisingly well this mod works, I ended up ranking it fairly high for being very original. But once again, like after 10 minutes of playing, there's really not much new to it. In this category, we start at number 82 with Explorer. And Explorer was a very interesting experiment. So in Explorer, the concept is essentially, what if you had Warband but without a world map? So you want to travel from town to town, you actually have to explore the countryside. And the bandits you come across will just attack you out of nowhere instead of warning you, instead of being able to see them coming. And in that sense, it makes for a fairly interesting experience, but what this mod really made clear is that Warband really does need a world map in order to work properly. Because the moment you remove that, then you're just making traveling an absolute massive grind. So it was an interesting idea, but I don't think the execution was great. At number 81, we have the Ego and the Radiant Cross. I honestly don't know why this one was recommended to me, because it really doesn't bring much. So to put it simply, imagine Calradia in the 1500s, but also it's the mod from the first game, not Warband, and also the town scenery doesn't exist anymore. This is the biggest issue with this mod, is that while it does bring new items like guns and new types of troops, sieges are essentially non-existent. It's just one massive slaughter on an empty field. Because of that and a bunch of other things, the Ego and the Radiant Cross is buggy as hell, and there's just not much to it. At number 80, we have Toloberia. Toloberia is a mod I discovered in one of my first mod videos, and initially I was pretty impressed with it, mostly because of the fighting fencing animation, which I thought was really cool. But since then, I've discovered that the sum mod is actually present in a lot of different mods, so Toloberia in that sense lost its uniqueness to me. And in terms of everything else, I mean, it's got a whole new world, it's got a bit more scenery, but I haven't really noticed any new significant features, and as such, Toloberia is pretty forgettable. At number 79, we have Skyrim Civil War. This mod, as the title suggests, takes you to the world of Skyrim, and in that sense, from the scenery to the items to some of the non-human species that you would find in Skyrim, this mod is actually pretty immersive. The problem is that while it transported native Warband to the world of Skyrim, it doesn't offer anything else at all. There's no new features, the tournaments are the exact same, as are the quests, there's nothing unique, and as such, I mean, if you don't want to try Warband in Skyrim, you can, but once that charm itself is lost, there's nothing else. At number 78, we have the Triple Alliance. This one was actually in my backlog, and I reviewed it specifically to add it to this ranking, and yeah, as you can see, it doesn't rank really high. So the Triple Alliance is set in South America and centers on the fight for independence of the Republic of Paraguay. So it's the 1800s, there's guns, there's grenades, there's a lot of new scenery, and in that sense, the mod is pretty solid. The one thing that I noticed though when I was playing it is just how wildly inaccurate the enemy AI is. I mean, you can see it right here for yourself. I brought my firing line so close to the enemy and they still couldn't land a hit. The AI in this mod are worse than stormtroopers, and because of that, I just ended up abusing the crap out of the enemy. Even in a siege where they outnumbered me 4-1, I just rolled through them like a bulldozer. As such, the mod has a pretty cool setting, don't get me wrong, but the AI really needs to be fixed on this because it makes battles practically impossible to lose. At number 77, however, we do have a slightly better mod in a very similar setting, and this is Independence of Chile. And we're in the same time period, and this is, you know, the country of Chile trying to get their independence, you know, it's pretty straightforward. So you still have a bunch of countries in South America as well, you still have the guns, you still have the uniforms, you still have the scenery. In my experience, Independence of Chile is not a particularly memorable gun mod because outside of that setting, it doesn't actually offer much else in terms of new features, and so I find the mod to be pretty generic, but at least the AI is better than in the Triple Alliance. At number 76, we have Calradia's Borderlands. This is a mod that basically takes Calradia and makes it much bigger by adding a whole bunch of islands and expanding the continent, making Calradia absolutely massive. But not just that, a lot of those factions bring in new cultures. For example, there is a ninja faction, there's a Japanese faction, there's a bunch of other ones. The biggest problem I have with this mod is that I am absolutely fed up playing in Calradia, so making it bigger is just not gonna have much of an appeal to me. There's a few extra features, but not a whole lot, so it might actually be a decent mod for people who are new to modding and just want to try something that's not too ambitious, but besides that, you know, pretty forgettable as well. Following the pattern of being a bit forgettable, at number 75 we have Wind of the War. This is a pretty decent Renaissance mod that covers the entirety of Europe, but while it has the guns and while it has the new armors, the mod itself, you can see for yourself, is largely incomplete. A lot of the faction rulers still have the exact same names as a native, a lot of castles don't even have proper names, so, you know, it's playable, it's stable, but it doesn't really offer anything else other than the aesthetic. At number 74, we have Iskla mod, which I never know how to pronounce, and this is yet another mod that improves upon native by adding a couple of extra features, such as the ability to start as a ruler, you also have the ability to customize your own troops, and there's more layers of kingdom management. So once again, if that's what you're looking for, this might just do the trick, but it's not perfect. There's a lot of glitches, namely, a lot of faces from the NPCs are just squished in, I don't know why, and although you can start as your own ruler, I could not figure out a way to declare war through diplomacy, which is a pretty glaring mistake. But I mean, if you want to start as ruler in Calradia and create your own custom troop trees, then this mod is for you. At number 73, we have The Reckoning, The New Beginning. This is actually the third sequel in the series The Reckoning, which are a series of zombie mods, some of which I will cover later on, but The New Beginning was the latest of the bunch, and as a zombie mod, it's probably the most insane and hardcore of them all, though that's mostly because the mod is incomplete. The zombies are pretty powerful, sure, but that could easily be solved if you just have guns, except no guns are being sold in the stores anywhere, that's just missing. But if you do cheat and get yourself some good gear and get yourself some mercenaries and want to fight hordes of zombies, the mod in that sense is pretty simple, it's just that besides that, it doesn't offer anything else. Number 72, we have New World 1521. This mod actually centers once again in South America, but you're playing as the native tribes and civilizations of the New World. So you want to be an Aztec warrior and have a bunch of elite Jaguar warriors with you, you can absolutely do that. And I gotta say, the mod is one of the most gorgeous, colorful mods that I've ever played. The reason it's not higher on the list is because it's largely incomplete, and even with the script enhancer, it is very prone to crashing. Like seriously, it'll crash all the time. But if you can look past that and you just want to experience this Aztec mod of sorts, then this is actually a pretty cool mod. On number 71, we have Golden Earth, which in a way is like the insert to Golden Earth 1521, in that this is also a mod that is centered on the Americas and the natives, but this one isn't nearly as prone to crashing. But the setting here is also pretty interesting, because while it's not the Aztecs, it's more set in North America, this is also at the time of the Vikings exploring the continent for the first time. So the items, the scenery, the music, and the vibe overall is very similar to Viking Conquest, in fact. It's just that you're a Viking, and you're in North America fighting the natives. Similarly, you could also join the natives and fight off the Vikings and kick them off your land. So it's a pretty cool mod in that concept. The problem is that, once again, there aren't that many gameplay changes, and the map is actually so big and vast that it also tends to be very sparse. There's not a lot of bandits, there's just not a whole lot to do. But if you like this setting, then, you know, give it a shot, it's actually pretty cool. At number 70, we have Calradia 1417. This mod takes us to the late medieval period in Calradia, so there's a lot of new items, there's a lot of new animations, there's guns, but once again, just not that many features besides that. There are so many other mods from the late medieval period that doesn't necessarily keep you in Calradia that this one is playing it safe, if you will. At least it's very stable. At number 69, we have Hispania 1200. This mod takes us to the Iberian Peninsula in the Middle Ages. So you have a caliphate in the south, and you have Catholic kingdoms in the north, and despite the fact that it's just a map of the Iberian Peninsula, it's actually massive. There's lots of castles, there's lots of villages and towns, and from a campaign perspective, the armies are also massive, so it can make for a lot of really epic battles, and the sieges have also been revamped from native, making them a lot more interesting. But once again, once you go past that aesthetic, the mod doesn't offer any significant unique features. At number 68, we have Fantasy Calradia. If you're new to modding and you want to try some fantasy mods, this one is actually a really good place to start. And as the title suggests, it's fantasy in Calradia. So you have Calradia, but you now have the addition of fantasy units. So there's lots of elves, there's also some orcs and some undead, and there's the addition of magic where you can buy spells from different guilds across Calradia. So fighting in Calradia with some spellcasters against non-human species, that's about as Fantasy Calradia is gonna get. It's not the most ambitious or amazing fantasy mod, but it certainly makes for a good start. At number 67, we have 1860s America. If you want a Wild West mod, well, look no further, because that's exactly what this one is. You get to be a gunslinger in America, you can fight bandits, you can fight the tribes, you have your guns, and if you actually want to take part in the American Civil War, well, you can hire troops from the Confederacy, you can hire troops from the North, you can build your armies and just go to war. Aesthetically speaking, the mod is really gorgeous, but once again, no extra features beyond that, so going on a campaign in this mod feels pretty empty and incomplete. For me, the best way to play this mod is as a solo wanderer, but even then, it's like 10 hours of gameplay tops. Number 66, we have L'Aigle. L'Aigle is based on the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s in Europe, so we have a massive map of Europe, and historically speaking, in terms of immersion, this mod is drop-dead gorgeous. It's actually one of the most gorgeous mods there is. The problem with this mod is that it's very much centered on guns, and it very much went out of its way to make guns deadly but wildly inaccurate. So while it's cool aesthetically, the biggest problem with this mod is that battles will tend to drag on for a very long time, especially because the AI is phenomenally bad. He never forms a proper line, instead he will just charge. But because troops can't reload their guns and walk at the same time, a lot of battles just end up being stuck into place. So L'Aigle is a very beautiful mod, but in terms of gun mods, it's actually pretty weak. Number 65, we have the Red Wars, which is a much better gun mod in my opinion because it takes us to the 1900s, but it also takes us to the 1900s in Calradia, and as such has a very interesting aesthetic because it will borrow ideologies from the time period. So you have some communist states, but you also have some Nazi states, so it makes for some pretty funny moments. The guns in this mod are fairly accurate at a long distance, and they can fire multiple rounds before needing to be reloaded, and as such that makes battles far deadlier than in any other gun mod. The problem is that the Red Wars ultimately was never finished. So while it has a lot of cool stuff, there's also still a lot of native scenery, which kind of breaks the game because now you're using guns. So it's a pretty funny mod, but there's not that much more to it. Number 64 is Snow in the East, which is essentially the Red Wars but in a more historical setting. Specifically, the mod is centered on World War II on the Eastern Front between Nazi Germany and Communist Russia, and all of the other factions that existed at the time. In that sense, the mod is beautiful, it's immersive, but the guns being a lot more accurate and deadly can also cause the gameplay itself to be broken. Sieges in this mod are essentially impossible, you'll just get mauled in minutes. But if you enjoy World War II and you enjoy this specific setting, then it's still a pretty cool mod to try. At number 63, we have 12th Century, which is one of the few mods I've played that takes us to Asia, specifically in China and the surrounding countries. In that sense, the mod is pretty decent. You've got the scenery, you've got the items, pretty cool. The problem is that the mod still feels largely incomplete and is also kind of too big for its own good. The map is so large that it extends all the way to the Middle East, but it's like, if you make a mod in China, no one is gonna bother with the Middle East, so you might as well focus on making Asia more polished, which is not what this mod does. In fact, because they were too focused on making the map bigger, they didn't really add anything to the gameplay. There's also very few bandits in the world map. The markets themselves, they're not optimized, so a lot of times finding mod items is very difficult. You still have a lot of native stuff, and on top of that, the mod can be a bit buggy at times. So in terms of mods that primarily center on China, this is probably the weakest of them all. And number 62, slightly better, is 180 Euros, which is also set in medieval China, but this time there's also a bit of a story going on, and there's a couple of interesting features, such as the ability to duel an enemy in battle, which I think is pretty cool. The problem is that this is also a mod that was never fully finished, so there's a lot of spelling errors, and there's also still a lot of native scenery. And number 61, this is The Reckoning, which is the first of the 3 zombie mods. And in terms of ambition, in terms of experimental, this is actually a really impressive mod. It does an excellent job of bringing you to the zombie post-apocalypse. The zombies are about as well designed as you'd hope them to be in a Warband mod. But what actually really made this mod interesting is not only the addition of guns, but the addition of mechanics that allow NPCs to take cover while they're shooting. This is a feature that was recycled in one of my favorite mods that we'll talk about later on. But in terms of actual mods, in terms of replay value on its own, as a zombie mod, it's not impressive. The zombies are still very limited. There's a whole gameplay feature centered around scavenging villages for supplies and then trading those supplies for ammo and stuff, but it tends to be very repetitive and gets boring very quickly. So as a mod on its own, it's very unique, but it's not the best. At number 60, we have Grande Armée. Grande Armée is essentially the successor to L'Aigle, if you will, because it literally takes the same setting, it takes most of the same stuff. The difference with Grande Armée is that they tweaked the AI considerably to make it a lot better. They've also tweaked a lot of things, like the accuracy of muskets, and as such, it's basically polished L'Aigle. It's the same thing, but the battles are slightly more intense. So if you actually like the setting, I would say you can completely skip L'Aigle at this point because it's not been updated in a while, and you can just stick to Grande Armée. And finally, at number 59, the last in this category, this is Sword of Damocles. This mod is actually one of the first ones I've ever played on Warband, and it essentially takes you to a different world that is one of the biggest I've ever played. It does include all the native factions, but it also brought a bunch of new ones. There's a lot of new items, there's the addition of guns, and overall, it's a pretty solid mod for what it intended to do. This is also, to my knowledge, one of the first mods to introduce new projects that you can build in towns and castles, and there's a lot of variety here that can be found in other mods that were made afterwards. But in fact, one of my favorite features from this mod is the fact that it skipped through a lot of the grind that you get in other mods by just making everything much bigger. So if you wanted to make a lot of money in a tournament, you can bet a lot more and by extent win a lot more, so you can make a fortune very quickly. Similarly, if you want to recruit troops, you're not limited to like a group of 5 mercenaries or a group of 5 recruits. In Sword of Damocles, when you recruit in a tavern, you'll often have like 200 mercenaries that you can hire on the spot. And this really does encourage you as the player to just carelessly throw your men into the fire because you don't really care. As soon as you need more troops, you can just hire them in bulk easily and quickly. This is one of those things that I wish other mods would do. The reason ultimately that the mod doesn't rank any higher is because while it has a lot of these cool features, at the same time it doesn't offer anything else. The mod is unnecessarily too big for its own good, the music is pretty depressing, and outside of those features I just mentioned, there's no real changes to gameplay whatsoever, so compared to a lot of mods we're going to still see on this list, it makes sense that it still ranks pretty low. But okay, now we're moving to the good but redundant mods, and there's still so many more to go. So at number 58, this is Tainted Paths. Now, Tainted Paths is a mod that I played only a few times, and every time I get the impression of like something that is really ambitious. You've got a map that extends from Europe all the way to Asia, which on its own is already impressive before you take into account that you can pick from 3 different time periods, which is insane. One of the key selling points is the much more complex level of strategy. For example, you could tell different groups of units to attack specific other groups from the enemy army, which on its own is pretty cool, but the main reason ultimately that the mod ranks relatively low compared to all the features that it has is because those same features are also confusing as hell. I still haven't figured out how the party limit is 40,000, or why soldiers are called armies instead of something else, or why the towns have so many different things that you can visit that all seem kind of inconsequential. So it could be a very solid mod if it wasn't as confusing. But anyway, moving on. On number 57, we have A New Dawn. A New Dawn, much like Calradia Borderlands or Iskla mod, is one of the mini mods that only aim to improve native, and as such these types of mods tend to be very redundant for me. One of the things I did enjoy a lot about the mod was how they improved the horse damage for charging. This is something that every mod should do honestly, just being able to bulldoze through troops with a cavalry charge, that'd be pretty cool. But one of the main things that is memorable of A New Dawn is the fact that large groups of bandits can form up and eventually take towns, and from there create their own factions. So there's a lot of potential for chaos in this mod, and if that's your thing, then go for it. But speaking of redundant mods that just improve upon native, number 56 is Native New Design. I do appreciate it slightly above A New Dawn just because I found the few features that it did bring up to be a little more appealing to me. Namely, combat just feels a lot more hardcore, there's lots of new sound effects, there's new troop trees that you can mess around with. The only real issue I had with this mod really was that using ships was a bit buggy, but that was a while ago, I'm sure it got updated and fixed. At number 55 we have Flores Evolved, which also has a lot of features of its own. As to why it's better than Native New Design or A New Dawn, again it's highly subjective. What I think I like most about it is that it just feels refreshed, you know, there's more music, there's lots of different things going on, it's just a refreshed vibe really. It also boasts on ModDB that you could technically have people join you online onto your campaign, which does sound pretty cool, but I've never bothered to try it. Maybe you could with your friends, you know, it's up to you. On number 54, we have Sands of Faith, and this is the first of several mods based on the Crusades that we're talking about. Of all of those, I think Sands of Faith is like the first, so a lot of the other mods are based off of that one, and I mean, it's a Crusade mod, and it's about as good as you'd expect it to be. There's lots of new units, you've got the Middle East for a map, there's a couple of new features. Honestly, it's pretty good, but I do think there are better Crusade mods out there, so this one is a little redundant, but you can't go wrong either way. At number 53 we have Diplomacy for Ledum Reloaded. I really mean it when this is redundant, because this is just another mod that improves upon native. So it's got a bunch of new features. I think the most memorable one of them is the cool siege towers when going on a siege, but at this point, again, when it comes to playing native with a couple of extra mods on top of it, between this one, the ones I already mentioned, and the ones I still have to mention, it's going to be highly subjective. At number 52, we have Kalarat Gur. Now, Kalarat Gur is also a mod based on native that adds a couple of extra features, but it at least has a central quest. And in this central quest, the goal is to become Kalarat Gur, which is like the Calradian Emperor. And you do that by finding relics that some bandits hide, and once you do, like, all the other factions are going to go to war against you. So it makes for a very interesting, challenging premise, if that's your thing. The only issue is, the spelling is a bit off, and the mod can get grindy. At number 51, we have Medieval Conquest. Medieval Conquest is a mod based off of 1257 AD, which is one of the biggest medieval mods for Warband that I have yet to mention. You can imagine why. But essentially, if you wanted 1257 AD with a bit more features on top of it, well, Medieval Conquest is going to be for you. But overall, that's all it is. It's a massive map of Europe. You can start as a nobleman, you can start as a commoner, or you can start as the ruler of a faction. So there's lots of stuff going on, and it's pretty good, but because it's based off another mod, it's also pretty redundant. At number 50, we have Deeds of Arms and Chivalry, which, much like Medieval Conquest is based off another mod, this one is also based on a mod that I have yet to bring up. But if Medieval Conquest takes all of Europe, Deeds of Arms and Chivalry is specifically focused on France during the 100 Years' Wars in the late medieval period. As such, you've got everything you can ask for. You can also start as a ruler. It's overall pretty good, but again, I have to think of it as redundant because it's just a few changes from an already pretty solid mod that did most of the work itself anyway. At number 49, we have Bellum Imperi, which is going to be the first of many Roman mods, and in this specific case, I mean, if you want to play a Roman mod, I mean, it's the Roman Empire, split across many different provinces across Europe. There's also different cultures, like the Gauls, and the Britons, and the Germanics, and the Greeks. I don't really recall if this mod had any, like, significant features, but it's a Roman mod, it's pretty solid, so if you want to try a simple Roman mod, that Bellum Imperi is going to be it. At number 48, you have Banner Page, which is going to be, for a lot of people, the definitive mod that improves upon native Warband. So everything I've mentioned so far about all these other mods, well, Banner Page, for a lot of people, me included, feels like the most optimized of them all. It's got all kinds of crazy features, it's got lots of new gear, it's got lots of new music, new quests, multiple options to start a new game. Of all the mods in this category, it probably feels like the most redundant at this point, but of all the redundant mods, that's probably the best of them. So at number 47, we have Rust 13th Century Way of the Warrior. This one focuses on Eastern Europe at around the same time as 1257 AD, really. So you have the looming threat of the Mongols coming in from the east, and so it all makes for a pretty intense mod. The reason I don't really like it personally is because it was also designed to be ridiculously hardcore, and I mean it. Like, it's a very difficult mod to play, especially as a commoner. It's impossible to level up. Enemies are really tough to kill, and generally I don't like mods that have a bit of a challenge as long as those challenges can be customized to your preferences, and it's not the case in this mod, so really I just feel like the mod being that hard just doesn't help its case, you know? At number 46, we have Honor and Glory. Now, Honor and Glory is also based in Eastern Europe, but it goes a few centuries later, at a time where guns are becoming a lot more prevalent on the battlefield. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like the standalone expansion with Fire and Sword. In fact, it's pretty similar, like, I can't really see a lot of differences, so if you never played the DLC, you didn't buy it, well, you'll get a pretty close experience with Honor and Glory. Overall, it's a pretty solid mod. I don't really have a lot of complaints. The only thing I really don't like is that the battle formations tend to screw themselves up easily, as in, your army tends to rotate based on where the enemy is, but a single guy on a horse could cause your entire formation to screw up, and it's really annoying, the mods that are like that. So, you know, it's a good mod, just little things not for me here. At number 45, we have Sayazin. I think that's how you say it. It's yet another mod that I had in my backlog that I finally played just to include it in this ranking. And honestly, it has a very interesting premise. Sayazin is set in a fictional world, kind of like Calradia, but it doesn't have any fantasy of its own. However, based on the overall vibe, it kind of looks like late medieval period, like the rise of the Ottoman Empire. So there's lots of gun units, but there's still a lot of archer units. And while you have all these advanced empires fighting, you also have a lot of other factions that are a lot less advanced, so it can make for a very intense campaign. There's also several layers of kingdom management, and if you want, as one of the story options, you can choose to be the ruler of a specific faction, and then you have like your own unique challenges around that. Honestly, it's a really good mod. The only thing that really ruined it for me is the chronic low morale of armies, how impossible it is to raise it up, and just how easily, because of this, armies will rout in battle. I mean, seriously, as soon as I started the first game, my army's morale was already set to terrible, so I already had a bunch of soldiers deserting, and as soon as I got into battle, the slightest contact with the enemy army immediately causes a rout. And I'm not even sure how tied that is to morale, because I did manage to raise it later, but the same thing would still happen. I mean, look at this. The cavalry barely touched my army, and everyone is already fleeing. I am going to get some reinforcements, mind you, but that's not the issue. Because enemy armies are so quick to flee, it just makes battles drag on forever. And as such, I think like it's really the Achilles heel of this mod. If it wasn't for this, honestly, it would have ranked significantly higher. But moving on. At number 44, we have In the Name of Jerusalem. Until like last year, In the Name of Jerusalem was probably the best Crusade mod that you could ask me about. Set during the Third Crusade specifically, it's a very immersive mod, the scenery is on point, we even got new siege gameplay involving different siege engines, which I think is really cool. The battles are just hardcore, there's an interesting routing system where troops are more likely to rout if they suffer casualties very quickly. The only thing that makes this mod difficult, in my opinion, is the fact that until you're an actual lord, you can't even recruit units and villages. You can only rely on mercenaries, which really makes it hard for no good reason, in my opinion. At number 43, we have Legacy of the Dragon. This is a fantasy mod that is very much, in fact, like Fantasy Calradia. So there's a lot of non-human species, and you can also unlock a lot of spells by going to different guilds. The main exception in Legacy of the Dragon being that you're in a fresh new world with its own lore, and there's also a central quest that you can do to get lots of money that you can then use to buy some very expensive high-end gear. There's also dragons, but let's face it, they're not impressive. And I'm just not that invested into the world itself, but as far as fantasy mods goes, it's a pretty good one nonetheless. At number 42, Mountain Blade with Fire and Sword. So with Fire and Sword is not a mod, but a paid standalone expansion for Warband. It was actually the first DLC for Warband that actually introduced the physics of guns that would later be translated into so many other gun mods. But as far as the DLC itself, With Fire and Sword is based on the book of the same name, and much like with Honor and Glory that I said is based on With Fire and Sword, this is set in Eastern Europe. And it's about as immersive as it can get for the time period. You've got lots of cool items, you've got all the scenery, you've got some new mechanics for the sieges, and there's even like 3 main storylines that you can follow, although they can be very grindy at times. So ultimately the reason it doesn't rank as high is because, while it's pretty good at what it aimed to do, the story itself just isn't that entertaining. In fact, there's some things you can do in the game that can actually break the story. And I mean, it's still the same native soundtrack, which I think is kind of disappointing. And besides the few things I mentioned, for the most part, it's still the exact same gameplay. The kingdom management isn't improved, there wasn't anything really new besides the guns. So as far as I'm concerned, With Fire and Sword has its place in the history of Mountain Blade, but I do think a lot of the mods that came afterwards are just better. At number 41, pretty much dead center at this point, we have Prophecy of Pandora. It's been one of my hottest takes since the beginning. I know a lot of people love Prophecy of Pandora, and they have a lot of reasons to be. It is a massive mod, surprisingly stable, then there's a lot of new features to it, lots of new mechanics, but my reasons for not liking it that much have always been the same. While a lot of mods tend to just give you all the features to try on the go, Prophecy of Pandora is designed in a way where you really have to play it to really get all of the benefits in the long term. And to me that just sucks. Like, if all your special items and unique weapons are hidden behind tons of grind, to me that's just not fun. I enjoy like some unique quests, I enjoy a bit of a challenge, but in Prophecy of Pandora I just felt it dragged on, and you know, that's just not for me. Similarly, at number 40, we also have a really good mod that I just don't happen to like personally, but I can't deny how amazing it is. It's The Last Days of the Third Age. If you like Lord of the Rings, like, there's no point in looking anywhere else. The Last Days of the Third Age is as immersive and as faithful as it can possibly be. And with the script enhancer, you can have like those really big battles that are really more reflective of Lord of the Rings. There's also all the unique quests, the fact that you can choose to fight on either side of the war. It's really good. The only things I don't like about The Last Days of the Third Age is Lord of the Rings. I'm not a fan, I've never liked the movies, I just thought the whole thing was boring. There's also this weird currency system that I just don't like. It's basically, instead of having like a currency like actual money, you have influence points that you can only use with specific factions. So I understand what they were trying to do with it, I just feel it's restricting and it doesn't have to be. But overall, I mean, yeah, it's really a good mod, just, again, not my taste. At 39, we have Evlat. Evlat is a story-driven mod set in Calradia, and the story itself is pretty straightforward. You're actually a former adventurer coming out of retirement, and you even have your own kids as your starting companions, while all companions from Native are now longtime friends, and your first quest given by one of them is about buying some exotic tea. And while that itself is pretty simple, the storyline quickly derails with a bunch of obstacles that take you all over Calradia, in a bunch of cool battles that also grants you some unique items. Honestly, it's not a particularly engaging story, but it doesn't need to be. It's well crafted and it's refreshing, and overall it's a pretty good mod that you should definitely try out at least once. On number 38 we have 16th Century. 16th Century is a mod based on the entire world, probably the biggest world map I've ever seen in any game, from Europe to Asia, to Africa, to the Americas. All of the main cultures that we can think of in their respective regions are covered. So it really does make for a very interesting experience, especially if you want a mod where you can conquer the entire world. The only real problems with it is that outside of this massive, ambitious world, there's just not that much new to it, especially when it comes to kingdom management and going to war. But as a solo explorer, you'll have a lot of fun discovering all the new scenery, and there's also some dungeons with unique gear that you can explore for. So overall, 16th Century, not the best, but can't deny how ambitious it is. Number 37, Asgard, Story of Calradia. So this one is a bit old by this point, but much like Evlat, it's a mod set in Calradia that is also story driven. But what I really liked about this mod is that the story does gradually get more complex, but it also starts rewarding you over time, so you get lots of cool gear. At some point you can become a lord in the Kingdom of Swadia, and it just keeps going on from there. As such, it was a very fun mod to play through, with the only caveat being that the writing and the spelling is god-awful. At number 36, we have Sparta. Now we talk a lot about ancient Rome and how cool it is to play an ancient Rome mod, but when it comes to ancient Greece, Sparta is going to be the mod you want. It's immersive, it's absolutely beautiful, they even managed to recreate the phalanx formation, which I think looks amazing. The only real caveat of Sparta is that it was also designed to be a ridiculously hard mod to play. But if you cheat, then that won't be a problem at all, and you can really have a good time with this mod. Similarly, a mod that was also made by the same modder as Sparta, at number 35 we have Renaissance. And listen, you want a mod based on the Italian Renaissance? This is where you gotta go. You have a massive detailed map of Italy, you have all the items of the time period, you have the new sound effects and music. I really don't have much to say about it. It's a really fun mod. However, it wasn't designed to be as hard as Sparta, so it's definitely more accessible to the casual gamer. And at number 34 we have Adventure in the East. This mod is set around the time of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And so in the Middle East we now have the Eastern Roman Empire, but further in the east we have all these new kingdoms rising to challenge the Mediterranean power. So in this context, the mod is about as amazing as you'd expect it to be. We have all the new scenery, we have all the items, and there's also an option to play a story mode. And the story itself is pretty interesting, although it does get pretty grindy, but overall, for this specific time and place, Adventure in the East is a beautiful, very immersive mod that is still in active development. At number 33 we have Crusades and Jihads, and this here is probably my favorite Crusade mod, mostly because it is far more story driven than the other ones, but it's also got some cool animation, it's got some cool music, the Crusade factions are very immersive, the scenery is just beautiful. The only real downside I found to it is that it's a bit laggy, but if you play with the script enhancer, it should work just fine. At number 32, this is Age of Arthur. Age of Arthur is a mod based on Brittenwalda, a mod that will be mentioned much later, but essentially this is a mod based on the legend of King Arthur, so it's set in the UK during the Dark Ages. Because it's based on Brittenwalda, this means you have a huge map of the UK as well as northern France. The scenery is very immersive, you've got all the items of the time period, you've got new music. The mod also has a substantial layer of religion, where you can pick one religion and then declare war on the others, which I think was pretty cool. And of course you have King Arthur and all the characters, and you have a series of unique quests centered around that. So if you like the time period, if you like the history, and you like the legend of King Arthur, this mod is pretty good. The only thing I didn't like about it is that some of the sieges are a little buggy, but if you can look past that, then it's not a big deal. At number 31 we have Paradigm Worlds. Now, Paradigm World is probably the wackiest mod on Warband, but that's precisely what can make it really fun. So in Paradigm Worlds, this is set in a post-apocalyptic future where bioweapons have essentially completely destroyed the world, so you have all these crazy, wacky factions, from renewed medieval factions, to mutants, to zombies, to aliens, to all kinds of wacky stuff really. Like every time you play Paradigm Worlds, it's just one big WTF moment, but like I said, that's what makes it fun. On the downside, if you don't like this kind of whack, then Paradigm Worlds is not going to be great, but overall it's a pretty solid mod, I can't complain. At number 30, we have Age of Sword and Sorcery. And for this mod, I don't have a whole lot to say about it other than it's a very high quality mod. We have a beautiful, huge new world, we have lots of dungeons to explore, there's some great implementation of magic, there's that fencing sword animation I like, there's lots of guilds with lots of unique quests that you can join. The only drawback of Age of Sword and Sorcery is that a lot of the sieges can be buggy as hell, especially when the castles don't spawn. But you know, if you can look past that and you're not too concerned with kingdom management later in the game, then Age of Sword and Sorcery as a Warband mod is actually pretty solid. Number 29, we have Light and Darkness, Heroes of Calradia. This here is probably one of the best story-driven mods that we have on Warband, and it's set on the map of the first Warband game, which also makes it a little more refreshing. There's also some fantasy elements, there's even cutscenes, and again, it's very story-driven, so if you want to have like this feeling of being in a story, then this mod is really going to be good for you. The only issues I have with it is that because it's still set in Calradia, the vibe is still feeling very redundant, and some of the quests can be a bit grindy. But yeah, if you want a story-driven mod, I think it's a good one-time experience that you should definitely try out. At number 28, 1429, The 100 Years' War. I did bring up Deeds of Arms and Chivalry early on, and the mod it was based on is actually this one. The mod no longer exists, apparently the modder took it down after suffering some cyberbullying, which is unfortunate, but this is the same immersive late medieval France mod that you had with Deeds of Arms and Chivalry, with the difference being that there's a couple of unique quests, some of them work, some of them don't, but I mean, at the end of the day, if you want a 100 Years Wars mod, I really recommend that you try either this one or Deeds of Arms and Chivalry, but I do prefer this one personally. At number 27, this is Rome at War. Yet another Roman mod, I know, but this one is pretty cool because while a lot of Roman mods focus on Rome at the peak of its power, this one is bringing you straight at the very beginning of it. So a lot of the armors are a lot more primitive, and Rome isn't nearly as powerful as it would be in other mods. There's a lot more rival kingdoms around, which can make for a pretty fun campaign. Honestly, I didn't really have any complaints when I was playing this mod. It was to the point, it was simple, but it was great. The only real issue is that as far as I know, the mod was never finished, so there could still be some native elements here and there, but I haven't seen any. But if you want to try a Roman mod, this is as good as one to pick. At number 26, this is the last mod that I had in my backlog before making this video. This is 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms. When it comes to Chinese mods, I would say this is the definitive one, and it's actually very recent. It was released just this winter. So in this mod you have feudal China, as it's completely fractured between different emperors and dynasties and kingdoms, and just everyone is fighting each other, so it makes for a very intense campaign. In terms of scenery and items and music, it's simply gorgeous. I have no complaints whatsoever. Even the battles using the script enhancer for an increased battle size were really awesome. And the routing mechanic is pretty solid compared to previous mods. So like, if you really manage to hit the enemy hard and fast, you can get the entire army to rout. And for me, that was such a glorious Total War moment. I really enjoyed the battles in this mod. The one thing I did not like about the mod, and the reason it's not higher on the list, is the sieges themselves. I mean, you've got these massive walls that you could besiege, but in all the sieges I've tried so far, you just go straight to the gate, and that's that. I think that's pretty lame, considering all the hard work they put into other aspects of the mod. You wish the sieges were a little more intense. In that regard, 180 euros is actually better, but I'd say that's the only thing that it does better than 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms. At number 25, we have 1257 AD. And here, when it comes to medieval mods, there's really no point in looking anywhere else. 1257 AD is an absolute massive mod that covers all of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, with all of the factions of the time period. In the mod, you can start as a commoner, but you can also start as a lord, or even as the ruler of a kingdom. And from there, everything is just crazy. There's lots of kingdom management, the scenery is on point, there's really not much I can say about it. So really, if you want an historical mod, this is going to be one of your top picks, for sure. And finally, for the pretty good mods, at number 24, we have Chronicles of Might and Magic. In terms of fantasy mods, I really do like this one because of just the sheer variety in the fantasy elements. You have so many different types of mythological creatures and fantasy species in there that it's just a glorious melting pot the moment you get into any kind of battle. There's also lots of magic with different spells that have their own mechanics and textures, which I think is really cool. And like a lot of fantasy mods, this one also has dungeons that you can explore for unique loot all over the map, with the exception here that these dungeons have a lot of troops in there, but you can also bring your whole warband with you, so it makes for some absolutely epic raids. The biggest downside for me is that I know the mod is based on the Heroes of Might and Magic game series, and I don't even know it, so chances are there's a lot of charms to it that are lost on me. It also had a very strong opening, with a portal that opens in a town and all these demons start pouring through, and it made for a great intro for the mod, but there's no story afterwards, it just goes straight to sandbox, which I think is a little disappointing. At number 23, we have the Reckoning Third Stage. This is the last one to cover in the Reckoning trilogy of zombie mods, and the Reckoning Third Stage is probably one of the most ridiculous but also most ambitious mods that I've ever seen on Warband. So as a post-apocalyptic zombie mod, well, we still have a lot of zombies, we still have a lot of guns, but the main difference in the Reckoning Third Stage is that we also now have the addition of motorcycles, of cars, of helicopters, and even tanks. And because of all this is probably the mod that brings us the closest to an actual, like, modern combat mod. These can all make this mod absolutely awesome to play. The only issue I've had with the Reckoning Third Stage is that because of all these new things, the mod also tends to be very buggy, but keep in mind that when I was playing it without the script enhancer. If you do play with the script enhancer, you might still crash a bit, but it's a lot more stable, and that makes it so much more fun. At number 22, we have Star Wars Conquest. Now, in terms of Star Wars mods, I've said it before, but porting Star Wars into Warband would seem like a pretty big challenge until you actually play the mod yourself and realize just how amazing it is. This mod recreated the entire galaxy of Star Wars. You've got all the planets with all of the scenery, you've got the laser rifles, you've got the stormtrooper outfits, you've got the lightsabers. Honestly, in terms of total conversion, Star Wars Conquest is a really solid mod, so if you enjoy Star Wars, look no further, you'll have a blast with this one. On number 21, we have Suvarnabhumi Mahayup. I think that's how you pronounce it, I have no idea. But this mod is a historical mod that takes us to Southeast Asia, specifically in Indonesia and Vietnam, you know, that whole area. And it's right at the time of the Spanish explorers also coming in as well. So in this mod, you've got this really big clash of cultures. As such, this is a very immersive mod that covers a slice of history that we don't hear much of, but it actually makes for a really amazing mod. Between the guns and the war elephants and the jungle scenery, honestly, it's really solid. I would say definitely give this one a try. At number 20, we have Nova Eras. This mod is one of my classics, and probably one of the best native revamped mod there is. In this mod, we're taken back to Calradia, but in the 1500s, at a time that, similarly to our own history, also aligns with exploration of the New World. So in Nova Eras, there's a whole new continent on the other side of Calradia that you can now explore, where there's native tribes and you can set up your own colonies. The really cool thing about Nova Eras is that it offers a lot of different ways of beating the game that doesn't revolve around just conquering. So there's a lot of trading options, you can start your own businesses, you can rent up apartments, and like I said, you can create your own colonies, which I think is pretty cool. There's also a couple of unique quests, there's lots of interesting music, and on top of that you have the time period that brings new scenery, new factions, new items. Overall, Nova Eras is a really solid mod, although it can be a bit of a learning curve to get all of its complexities. It's still worth it, really good mod overall. At number 19, we have Rising Sun. This mod takes us to Japan at the end of the samurai era, if you will. So there's a lot of industrialization, you have a lot of gun troops now, but you also have some samurai factions that are fighting against the modernization. Now obviously the mod is based on Gegokujo, which is a mod that I have yet to bring up, but in terms of gun mods, it's just a really fun one overall, and because it's based on Gegokujo, it's also very immersive, very beautiful all around, and it really just makes for a really fun gun mod. I don't have much to say about it. It's a gun mod set in industrial Japan, and it does a really good job of it. At number 18, we have American Civil War Revived. As the title suggests, this mod takes us to the Civil War in America in the 1860s, and honestly, it's an amazing mod overall. American Civil War Revived was designed specifically to have you play as the general of one of the leading armies in the conflict, and as such, you start with a massive party limit, you have lots of troops at your disposal, and the only objective here is to conquer the other half of America. The firing line works about as well as you'd expect. They added a lot of sound effects, so you hear a lot of death screams that are really unsettling. The mod is also very hardcore. As a single player, you don't have a lot of options, you really just gotta throw a lot of men into the fray, and it just makes the mod amazing overall. It's still in active development, they've been adding new scenery too, and the battles are just amazing. And once again, I don't have much to say, it's a really solid gun mod. but not as solid as number 17, which is Between Empires. Between Empires, in a lot of ways, is similar to American Civil War Revived, but instead it takes us to Europe between 1860 and 1914, the First World War. And this mod probably has the best implementation of artillery that I've ever seen in any mod. Add to that the semi-auto guns, the vast amount of troops you can get on either side, the ability to dig trenches, to get into trench warfare, and you have possibly one of the most hardcore gun mods there is. It's really well made, so between this mod, American Civil War, and Rising Sun, you have a lot of options when it comes to like large-scale gun battles. And yeah, I just think Between Empires is probably the best of them all, but it's also the most hardcore. At number 16, we have Touhou Gensokyo Warfare, which I've been told I'm pronouncing completely wrong, but you know what? No one corrected me, no one told me what's the real pronunciation, so I'm sticking to it. So, Touhou Gensokyo Warfare is based on the Touhou Project, which is the series of video games based on the world of Gensokyo, which is some kind of fictional world within Japan where fantasy exists. And while I don't know the world itself, and surely knowing about it would make this mod all the more enjoyable, the mod is nonetheless very good on its own. For starters, it adapts some kind of anime aesthetic, as I call it, and I think it works surprisingly well for Warband. There's also tons of new scenery, there's lots of items and music. It's overall a very charming mod, to be honest. And there's also a story mode, which is surprisingly complex. And so if you like the aesthetic, if you like the world, or if you want a story mod, well, Touhou Gensokyo Warfare offers all of these, and it does all of them very well. At number 15, we have Blood and Steel. This is actually one of the oldest Warband mods that I found, and it's the epitome of simplicity is bliss. You could consider it yet another one of those native revamped mods, but this one is really aimed at mindless, massive, ridiculous battles, and it just makes it so much fun. So in Blood and Steel, we are in Calradia, but we now have a lot of fantasy units, especially in bandit groups, but also all of the groups, from caravans to lords to garrisons, they all number in the hundreds of troops now, making for absolute massive battles. But similarly to Sword of Damocles, this also makes it a lot easier to just recruit a whole bunch of troops at once, and to just throw them into the fray, and it really just makes for, as I've said, really epic battles. And sometimes that's all it takes to be happy. So the mod isn't really complicated, but it doesn't need to be. That's what makes it awesome. And for that alone, I ranked it fairly high, because while it's not as ambitious as other mods, at least what it aims to do, it does very well. Moving on to number 14, we have Struggle for the Iliac Bay. Now, a long time ago in this video, I mentioned a mod based on Skyrim, and Struggle of the Iliac Bay is similar in that it's based on a different game in the Elder Scrolls series, Daggerfall. So in this mod, you have a map centered around the Iliac Bay, you have all of the factions from the game, as well as lots of its items. Honestly, probably the only reason it doesn't rank higher on the list is because I haven't really played the Elder Scrolls games, so once again, a lot of the charm is lost on me. But as a mod, it's actually a really solid one. There's a lot of variety in the scenery, in the music, in the items. There's also the fencing animation I like. There's lots of dungeons to explore for loot. You can also join a bunch of guilds that give you unique quests as well as unique gear, and overall it just makes for a great experience. If you enjoy the Elder Scrolls series or Daggerfall, then this mod will probably be a great experience for you. At number 13, a mod that is very similar because it was made by the same modder as Struggle for the Iliac Bay. This is World of Vaznar. And honestly, the only difference between World of Vaznar and Struggle for the Iliac Bay, the significant difference, is that one is based on a different game, and World of Vaznar is a completely unique setting. Because other than that, they have the same fighting animation, they have the same spelling system, they both have dungeons that you can explore for loot, but I do tend to prefer World of Vaznar better because it comes up with its own world, and it's got a very fascinating Gothic/Renaissance aesthetic that I think is simply gorgeous. So really, you could pick either mod to get the relatively same experience, but I do prefer the World of Vaznar more for its originality. At number 12, we have A Clash of Kings. A Clash of Kings is based on the Game of Thrones world, and in terms of adaptation mods, I would say it's one of the most faithful adaptations there is. And the only difference for me between this mod and a mod like The Last Days of the Third Age is that while I find Lord of the Rings to be really boring, I'm actually a massive fan of Game of Thrones. So when it comes to this mod, I fell in love at first sight. It is simply a gorgeous mod. It's got the entire world of Westeros and Essos, it's got all of the characters, it's got all of the items, there's also tons of unique quests, lots of unique places to explore for the lore and some unique loot, and with the script enhancer, you can have much bigger party sizes, which makes battles all the more hardcore. So really, if you're a fan of Game of Thrones, like, I can't really find any flaws to this mod. In a lot of ways, it feels like perfection. At number 11, we have Warsword Conquest. Warsword Conquest is also an adaptation mod in that it's based on the Warhammer fantasy universe. And in the context of fantasy, it's really hard to beat, because Warhammer is already so ridiculous with all the fantasy tropes, all the fantasy creatures, all the wacky words and lore, that putting this into a mod is bound to be just as intense, and that's exactly the case with Warsaw Conquest. Whether you want to create an army of chaos, or you want to be with the goblins, or the undead, or the humans, or the lizardmen, there is so much variety in Warsaw Conquest that regardless of what faction you pick, you will always find yourself in the craziest of battles. Honestly, it's very difficult to sum up Warsaw Conquest in so few words. It's just crazy fun, and probably one of the most ambitious Warband mods there is, and it's still in active development too. At number 10 we have Gekokujo. Gekokujo is the quintessential samurai mod for Warband. It's set in the 1600s, features an entire map of Japan with all of the clans from this historical period. In terms of scenery, of fighting animation, of music, of the weapons and armors, this mod is, in what it intends to do, basically perfection. For anyone new to Warband modding, I would really recommend this mod as a first tryout, because in a lot of ways it's still very similar to native Warband. It just adds a bunch of some mods on top of native. So in addition to being in Japan, you also have the freelancer mod, which allows you to enlist yourself into other lords' armies. It's got the diplomacy sub mod, which gives you more kingdom management layers, and it has gun units as well, so you can get used to mods with guns. It also went out of its way to create two troop trees between the Ashigarus, the peasant conscripts, and the samurai, the warrior class, which are more expensive but better trained. And the sieges are just so much fun with the Japanese castles, the way they are designed. Honestly, Gekokujo, in a lot of ways, it's fairly simple compared to other mods that brought more features, but the quality of the immersion cannot be compared. It is simply amazing. At number 9 we have Warzone Akron. Warzone Akron is a mod that was released just last winter, and it's basically a post-apocalyptic world primarily based on the Fallout universe, although Akron itself is a fictional world. But as a gun mod, I would say it's probably the best gun mod on Warband there is, mostly because it fixed a lot of the problems that other gun mods had. The ability to reload, the ability to aim and then fire, and it also borrowed the mechanic from the first Reckoning mod, where troops can actually use cover to fight from. As such, the mod is not necessarily as hardcore as mods like Between Empires or American Civil War Revived, but it doesn't need to be. This one, with its post-apocalyptic setting, the interesting items, and all of the different troops that you can have, this is the one gun mod in my top picks that I would definitely recommend. On number 8 we have Bones of Ragnvald. In terms of story-driven mod, Bones of Ragnvald is probably one of the most complex. It's got a fairly long story that is also very engaging, that also gives you a lot of history and lore into the world that it created. On top of that, it's a very solid fantasy mod with lots of fantasy species, especially the undead and those giant mutant spiders that I'm always raving on about. And it's got all the new items, it's got a lot of new scenery. So in a sense, if you want a hardcore mod that's got some dark undertones and you want it story-driven, Bones of Ragnvald is a mod I've been recommending for a long time. Another story-driven mod though that I just find more straightforward, lighter, and just as fun is at number 7 with Revenge of the Berserk. Revenge of the Berserk is based on the Berserk manga, and in this mod you play as the main character, Guts, which is a mercenary with a massive sword, and the entire point of the mod is just to follow along the story as you cut your way through hundreds of men. Honestly, it's a very good mod, and in terms of story-driven mods, it's also the most focused one. There's really not much room for sandbox in this mod. It's really story-driven, so you can just follow along and just have an absolute blast. So in terms of story-driven, plus the gameplay that I think is absolutely cool, I think Revenge of the Berserk is a really great mod that everyone should try. At number 6, this is Britannwalda. Now, Britannwalda is also a mod that I've praised and ranked highly many times in previous videos, and for good reason. Britannwalda is centered around the UK in the Dark Ages, and as such the mod has some very dark, grim undertones, but at the same time there's lots of opportunity. There's a lot of faction in this mod, but they're all relatively small, which makes for a very intense world campaign. There's also a couple of small dungeons where you can get unique loot, but one of the distinguishing features of Britannwalda that I've been wanting to see in every single mod is the ability to starve settlements out during sieges. In a lot of mods, besieging a castle, there's always like food stores, right? But they always last for like 100 days, which makes it impossible to just starve the garrison out. But in Britannwalda, there are many options to starve a garrison out, and usually that's just a safer alternative than just a full-on assault. And Britannwalda puts a lot of emphasis on that, and I just personally love this feature. I wish every mod had it. On top of all that, Britannwalda is also famed for being ridiculously hardcore. It's got a lot of features like bleeding and permanent injuries that can really mess you up, but thankfully these settings can be turned off in the options if that's not your thing. But overall, I just really love this mod. It's intense, it's beautiful, it's got it all. And number 5, we have A World of Ice and Fire. A World of Ice and Fire is the second mod based on the Game of Thrones, and compared to A Clash of Kings, it's pretty similar in terms of quality. It's also got the massive map, it's got all the items, it's got all the unique quests, all the locations. The main difference between A World of Ice and Fire and A Clash of Kings is that A World of Ice and Fire is also based on Britannwalda, in that it has the same hardcore features as well as the same siege mod, which again, I really love. So in terms of adaptation, it's really solid, and then it's also based on Britannwalda, so what more can you ask? And number 4, we have 457 AD Fall of the Western Roman Empire. This mod is also fairly recent, and as the title suggests, it's based around the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the late 400s. So in this mod you have a full map of Europe, but you have a lot of rising factions that are slowly crippling down the Roman Empire. But on top of that, the mod is filled with all kinds of unique quests that you can find all over the place by just exploring. The immersion is also excellent from the fact that the modders themselves are massive history buffs that do a lot of extensive research on every single item that they incorporate in the mod. And at the end of the day, I mean, the battles are really intense, everything is just really cool in the mod. So when I first played it, I immediately fell in love with it, from all the unique features, to the complex layers of kingdom management, to the unique quests. I ain't got no complaints, this mod is amazing, and as far as I know, is still in active development. And number 3, we have Out Caesar Out Nihil, which I'm positive I'm not pronouncing correctly. But in terms of ambitious mods, it's really hard to top this one. The mod is so big, it might as well be its own game. So this mod also takes us to the Roman Empire, but at the peak of its power, extending all the way from Britain in Europe to the Middle East and North Africa. The mod gives you many starting options, but if you start as Emperor, you immediately get tons of layers of kingdom management. So much so that I could never describe all of them in this one video. But the mod also offers tons of unique quests, and if you start as a commoner, you also have your own storyline that you can follow, which is amazing. So overall, in terms of Roman mods, it's probably the best out there. In terms of kingdom management, it's probably the most ambitious, and in terms of world map, it's also one of the biggest. So Out Caesar Out Nihil is probably the biggest, meanest, most intense Warband mod there is. I would not recommend it if this is your first time modding, but if you've tried other mods for a while, this might just be the mod that challenges you the most. And number 2, this is Viking Conquest. In a lot of my modding videos, people are always like, well, how come you didn't bring up Viking Conquest? It's pretty good. And the main reason is because, as I say all the time, Viking Conquest, much like with Fire and Sword, is not a free mod, but a paid DLC. So I've never really thought of including it in rankings, but because this video is about ranking everything, well, here it is, and I'm putting it at number 2. So Viking Conquest is based on Britannwalda. So for a bit of context, Britannwalda was made by a group of enthusiastic modders, but when the devs behind Mount & Blade Warband actually saw the mod, they liked it so much that they reached out to the Britannwalda team and they decided to collaborate together to make a DLC. So the Britannwalda team created Viking Conquest, which is very similar in fact to Britannwalda. It's almost the exact same time period, and while Britannwalda is centered on the UK, Viking Conquest also brings some Nordic countries on top of it. And there's a couple of differences between Viking Conquest and Britannwalda, but to name a few, Viking Conquest has a full story mode, which will keep you occupied for a good 10-15 hours. It's also introduced naval battles, which can be really cool if that's your thing. And the visuals have also been slightly improved, and there's a ton of tweaks as well. So if you've never played Britannwalda and you go straight to Viking Conquest, you'll pretty much get the same experience and then some. If you've played Viking Conquest, well, the only thing that Britannwalda really does better, in my opinion, is the recruiting system. The recruiting system in Viking Conquest is horrible. I don't know why they did it like that, but if you want more details, you can always check out my exclusive review on Viking Conquest. But overall, yeah, it's really solid. If I enjoyed Britannwalda, I was bound to enjoy Viking Conquest, and thanks to the technical support it got from the devs, it's also one of the most stable experiences you will have on Warband, despite it being very big and ambitious. And finally, at number 1, if you've been watching me for a while, you know what this mod is, and yes, despite all of the new mods I've tried over the past 2 years, this mod still ranks number 1, and this is Paris Snow. I don't really know what to say about this mod. I mean, I've summed it up so many times at this point, but think light fantasy, massive world, hardcore battles, overpowered units, unique quests, unique items, a massive invasion by an external force. and that's Paris Snow. It's just got all of the things that I usually look for in a Warband mod, and it does all of them extremely well. I would really recommend, if you want to get into Paris Snow, that you check out the guide I made on it like 2 years ago. I think it's still relevant, but overall, in terms of quality, of size, I've just always been content with Paris Snow, and truth be told, if I had to sacrifice every mod and only save one, ultimately Paris Snow would be the one that I decide to keep. And so it ends. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you've made it this far, and if you've made it this far but haven't subscribed yet, well, please do so. As of making this video, I'm nearing 10,000 subscribers. We gotta get there. Every little bit helps. And if this is the first Warband mod video you've ever seen, well, you can still binge the other ones I've made, because almost every mod I've mentioned in this video has been reviewed more substantially in my previous videos, if you want to learn more. I've also done lots of special rankings based on certain thematics, so if you want to look at mods specifically from the angle of the best historical ones, the best fantasy ones, the best gun mods, I've made a whole bunch of videos like that. They're all on my channel, so knock yourself out. As for the future of this channel, I will still be making modding content, just not on Warband. If you like the sequel, Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord, I've already made a lot of modding content of that one, so you can check that out as well. I've also done modding content for Fallout 4, and will probably do some more in the future, as well as a couple of other games I have in mind, so make sure to stick around for those. And if you want even more content that's not necessarily gaming, I've also been working on my second channel since the beginning of the year, so you can check that one out as well. But as far as Warband goes, yep, this is the finale. It's been quite the adventure, so thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.